And we are live January 14th. Ryan Ray alongside the Honorable Chris Fenton, Feeding the Dragon Show, Feeding the Dragon Podcast. Mr. Fenton, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. We posted the podcast came out on Spotify and Apple and everywhere else this morning. I've already gotten some really good feedback about it. I think we tackled some very heavy issues and tried to simplify it just for ourselves and hopefully for listeners too, by sort of simplifying down to the old high school experiences. And, the reaction from that, I think, was pretty interesting. A lot of people do like the keep it simple, stupid formula for understanding, processing, and digesting things that are really sort of hard to process, especially what happened January 6th. And I look at it the same way with China. So I'm glad people responded well to it. I did have some interesting comments about the title of the podcast and why we covered sort of January 6th in a way. Feeding the dragon probably relates to feeding China, right? And even my Twitter handle at the Dragon Feeder is about feeding China, right? And as far as I'm concerned, my Twitter handle is going to stay the Dragon Feeder until I, as a cog in the wheel, can help fix how much we are feeding the dragon of China. And then when you look at January 6th and what went down and where we are in this sort of perilous state as a country right now, with all of our attention diverted towards what just happened this past week, how do we fix it, who we hate, who we dislike, who we don't agree with, all that kind of stuff. And then even with the attention of maybe our president and our incoming president and our different security forces and everything else being completely preoccupied, I would say all of that combined with just the footage that is played over and over of January 6th in China right now on CCTV has been feeding the dragon quite extensively. So there's no better title for what we talked about yesterday and what we continue to talk about, which seems to have no relation to China, yet it has a lot of relation to China.
Yeah, and in the U.S., hey Chris, I'm getting a little feedback there. If you might want to mute me while I'm talking, so we don't get our listeners the ting there. Thank you. Much better, thank you, sir. In the U.S., you turn on Fox News, MSNBC. This isn't a criticism of those channels. They just play U.S.-centric news. If you go to Africa, Europe, China, wherever, they play global news. And so whatever's going on globally, which the U.S. is always have something on globally, they follow what we're doing. Whatever you think about that. And so when you're talking about U.S. and geopolitical stuff, what happens here, they cover far more than what we will hear a story occasionally about the Uyghurs and stuff like that. But unless you're covering a China show or the New York Times, which has a section devoted to it, mainstream news outlets just don't cover it. And that's not a commentary on the right or left. It's just how it is. And so places like us, when we try to talk about these issues, we are aware of that. And so we're like, well, we got to cover the U.S. side because the Chinese side is going to cover it for sure. And so it kind of puts us in that spot where we're almost forced to talk about these issues. What's going on in the U.S. because it does tie into China, and especially as you mentioned, they're playing on the news there, and it's a lot of propaganda. So we want to say, okay, well, we're going to hopefully get some Chinese nationals and some Americans listening to this podcast. And so how do we think about it? Because we want our voice to be part of that discussion. And as we say every episode, we want your voice to be part of it as well. So either at the Dragon Feeder on Twitter or at Ryan Ray Sr. on Twitter, let us know your thoughts because it is we're keeping it simple, stupid, understanding that it's a very complex issue that has a lot of nuance that we want to draw out as well.
Yeah, it's to me, it's always a fascinating sort of psychological study and almost a study of what propaganda works and doesn't work in the way the Chinese Communist Party thinks, right? I mean, you see it here in the United States of America where there might be outlandish stories or things that just seem, holy cow, I can't believe that just happened. And they might have something that's a little anti-right or a little anti-left in it. And you'll see how that news, even though it is news that all of us should digest, you'll see how it might be at the top of a page on CNN or MSNBC and at the bottom of a page on, say, Fox News or vice versa. That same type of messaging and, I guess, publishing of editing of what the news should be that they give to their viewers and the people that are supporting those particular networks here in the United States is the same way the Chinese Communist Party deciphers news around the world and decides what is going to be censored and what's going to be promoted. So I talked on an earlier episode about the Sandy Hook massacre back in December of 2012. I happened to be in Beijing during that, and they covered that news item super extensively because it just really showcased what they kept talking about and commenting about this Wild West, a very dangerous nation of the United States. Be careful going there. It's super dangerous. It's scary. People carry guns everywhere. They're shooting everybody up. It was really unbelievable how in your face they took that story and then extrapolated it into this more amplified narrative. And the same thing happened during the summer with the riots, the protests, the unrest that we had there. Portland, which has had ongoing issues, is constantly covered in China. And then, of course, January 6th has just been in everybody's face in China, whether it's watching the CCTV networks, whether it's watching the provincial networks, whether it's watching the local networks, or whether you're on streaming platforms, whether it's a Tencent or Alibaba, et cetera, getting your news. It is in your face because the Ministry of Propaganda wants them digesting that. And I'll give you one other item that's sort of interesting is that House of Cards, which was a huge hit series in the United States of America, Lionsgate, the studio, and the various other producers involved with it, never were able to monetize that show in China. They never sold it over there and never got officially recognized by the government as something that they would allow the US studios to monetize. Yet it was the most watched television series for a couple years because the Chinese propaganda ministry really pushed the black market sales and the black market sort of platform distribution of that show because it showcased how dirty and corrupt the United States democracy system was. Obviously, it was a fictional show, but they just loved the fact that it showed all the underbelly of what makes democracy and why it's so terrible and why communism is so great.
All great points. And for those listening, if you want to chime in, the comments are open. So Periscope, wherever you see the show, feel free. And also share it. Let people know if you like the content. The thing about Sandy Hook, and so I don't want to get into Sandy Hook per se, obviously that's not the point of the show, but from the CCP propaganda side, I had a lock blade knife on a train when I was in China. I didn't know that was a problem, and so they took me in the back, and I tell the whole story some other time. But it's illegal to have a lock blade knife, which I have a ton of them. I have one right in front of me, in open spaces or open public areas. I don't know what the proper definition is in China. So part of the propaganda when something like Sandy Hook happens, there's a lot of discussions that should be had on the U.S. side, but from their side, they want a populace that does not believe that they need to carry weapons. And that's an important thing to understand is that it's not that they want to get to the bottom of Sandy Hook and gun control laws in the U.S. They want their populace to believe we don't need weapons. Like those, when you give people weapons, whether it's a pocket knife, a lock pocket knife, or a AR-15, or a pistol, or a shotgun, all insert weapon here. That's a net negative for the populace, and so therefore it makes sense that they promote that. And same thing with House of Cards. We don't want people trying to think about the government as people voting and people doing this stuff. We want them to think of it as democracy is very corrupt. And again, I always say this: go read the quotes of Mao. Those are so helpful to understand how they might think and stuff. So. I didn't know the House of Cards thing. That's funny that they didn't pump it publicly, but on the black markets, they supplied it. So that way it could get out there and people felt like they may be doing something dirty, but they felt like the propaganda was the right type of propaganda. So that's interesting. I did not know that. Is there any other film or TV show that you were aware of that they've purposely pushed on the black market?
Well, I'll tell you, when Americans or people that are not super familiar with Chinese nuances look at particular content, sometimes you misjudge what might work and not work there. I remember in the case of the movie Hunger Games, which was another Lionsgate movie, which was essentially about the haves and have-nots, and this young woman who sort of rose as a leader of the have-nots, and then they overtake the haves and they create sort of this new system of government and society somewhere in the distant future. I remember a lot of people at the film markets that were looking at the movie, thinking about whether it would work in China or not, believing, oh, this is never going to be allowed in that market ever. And if it was, it would just come in through the black market. You would never monetize it. Well, that was the wrong thinking, because actually that movie represented a bit of the Cultural Revolution in itself, where actually the Maoists take over in 1949 of this imperialism, or this complete have and have not society, where suddenly a leader rose and took over control of this massive country and provided this idea that, now the masses would have and be in control of their destiny. So the Hunger Games movie actually became almost symbolic of what happened in 1949 and thereafter in the best forms of history and narrative that the Chinese Communist Party thinks about. So they actually supported that movie, not only getting into the market, but also being monetized, marketed, advertised, and really pushed so that their populace could see it.
Okay, so let's get into a couple of the news stories today. I don't know if you saw this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. We talked about it yesterday, but it's kind of a follow-up. I saw Nike came out and was saying that they're joining the band of people who are not sponsoring political Republicans, or maybe it's Democrats too. I don't know. They're pulling their hard-earned dollars out of our U.S. policy, and it kind of goes back to what we were saying yesterday. Nike has huge shops in China, and so it's like, okay, here we go. Disney came out and said the same thing, and of course, we've covered the Disney Mulan story on this show, and so. Any additional thoughts or reflections since we talked about that? Something like it was yesterday about how to engage these corporations when they come out and they're very critical of what happens here in the States, but they've turned a blind eye to what they're doing overseas.
Yeah, I think the narrative that every one of these companies or people that I've actually asked about in regards to the hypocrisy that's involved, phrase it, that narrative tends to be, oh, well, that's an international issue. That's something that's in the foreign space, a foreign market. We need to prioritize our own nation's needs and interests first. So we're going to focus on that now. The way we deal with international markets, way we deal with certain things that we don't agree with in some of those markets, that's conversation for another day.
Yeah, you've heard Cuban say that same thing over and over again, and it's kind of frustrating because he's never afraid to weigh in on something, even if he's completely off his rocker here in the U.S. So yeah, I think you're right. That's the frustration, is that you sit there and you get those same lines, and those lines aren't what we're wanting to hear. We're wanting to hear some pushback, some feedback. What's going on? But the other thing I saw you tweet out this morning is that when we talked about this, I think last week. So let's kind of recap. Last year, coronavirus kind of broke loose this time last year, more or less, when we started hearing the news reports about Wuhan and stuff. About May, it came out that the World Health Organization, who had said previously that China had worked with them, actually hadn't worked with them as well. Donald Trump talked about pulling out of the World Health Organization in May, roughly. And then there was a call, probably maybe before May, maybe in April-ish, for Trump was saying that, hey, the virus came from a lab and all this stuff. But other nations weren't saying that. They were saying, but we do want to know what happened. Can we send the World Health Organization down there? We want to pull, put some people on the ground, do some investigation. Australia said that, which got China mad at them right now. And so they sent a team, I think in July, roughly, down there. And then last week, 2 weeks ago, Chris, they were going to send a team, and China's like, no, you can't come. Now they send a team, and they pop for coronavirus in Singapore. Are we seeing a foreshadowing of what will happen with this trip, which is, one misstep after another? Or do you have confidence that anything productive is going to come out of the World Health Organization's investigation?
I don't know exactly how the WHO works and what the interaction is with the Chinese government, but it does seem like a little bit of a confederacy of dunces, or a sort of a clown car operation right now. I just thought it was completely ironic that China's allowing them in, and now suddenly these officials from the WHO can't even go because they tested positive. I think it was for the antibodies and not even the virus, but of course that means something similar. That's the problem, and China won't let them in. I mean, it's just like one ridiculously sort of stranger than fiction, anecdote after another. I don't know how this ends up, progressing. I don't know if the WHO is ever going to get anything really all that great out of this research. It's going to be whitewashed in regards to some of the stuff that probably really matters. And then on top of it, it doesn't even look like China has figured out this virus all that well too, because we've seen the Brazilian reports in regards to how ineffective the vaccine seems to be. So I'm not even sure if China is the best place to do research right now.
Well, so you brought up the vaccine. If you look at Kaiser Fung, he has a website called Junk Charts, I think is what it is.com. And if you go on his book blog on the right side and scroll down, he's gone through some of the Pfizer and Moderna literature, not like the PR pieces, like the actual literature of what they're saying. He's a statistician, kind of really smart guy. He's got a book number for your world worth checking out. And one thing he's pointed out is that, and I haven't followed the story in the past couple of weeks, but originally the reporting for Pfizer was that it's not 90% keeps you from getting the virus; it's 90% fighting the symptoms, which is different. And so when the Chinese article came out about 50% effectiveness, I wonder, is it 50% chance of reduction of getting the virus, or is it the same symptom thing? And that's something that hasn't gotten a lot of play in the U.S. because we're pushing the vaccine narrative right now pretty hard. But you would expect a vaccine to actually have about a 50% working rate. That's what like the flu does. And so I wondered if China kind of almost got a bad rap there because maybe their effectiveness rate is more in line with what we'd expect, and the U.S. is not exactly giving us the whole story. So I've kind of wondered about that, if they actually are getting the worst in the stick here. And I don't know. I've just kind of had questions on both sides of that discussion.
Yeah, in a way, I'm not even trying to cloud my brain with understanding all of that right now anyway, because there's no way in a million years we're going to be utilizing the Chinese vaccine or trusting really anything that comes from China in regards to data on this virus. We're sort of on our own. And then on top of it, I'm a little nervous about this vaccine that China wants to use with all of the sort of developing nations out there. Who knows what strings attached that's going to bring? As we know, the Belt and Road Initiative has all kinds of strings attached when it comes to financial aid and debt and all that kind of stuff that's really burning some of these countries in a bad way. Somehow I think there must be some sort of nefarious or not completely good Samaritan reason to really push a vaccine to these developing nations that we probably won't find out the answers to until many years down the road. And I have a feeling it's an answer we're not going to want to know.
No, that's a fair point, is that even if the working rate is like we think it should be, or maybe in line with historical vaccines, the fact that they are so generously pushing it out probably has to do with a longer play. As far as me, I think with the WHO going down there, I think I just want to at least feel like we're all giving it the best effort, and I don't even feel that way right now. And that's the problem. So it's, to your point, how much has been whitewashed, what's going to happen. I just want to feel like we're giving it the old college try, and it doesn't even feel like we're China, the WHO, everyone involved is doing that. The other thing, to your point, and this has been a point of frustration with me, especially in the U.S., is that we saw that they locked down a city outside of Beijing, I believe, 22 million people for like 70 cases or something like that. Now, I don't believe that there's 70 cases, but that's the official numbers. When on the U.S. side of things, you talk about how to deal with China, how to deal with propaganda, how to think through these issues. Outer layer of the onion discussion here. How do we talk to our population about hearing this news? Should we take it literally that 70 people got tested positive and so they shut down 22 million people? What are the concerns around that? So how do you balance that narrative coming back from China that, hey, yeah, we're taking it seriously, we shut down 22 million people? To me, that's a horror story.
Yeah, I mean, it plays a little bit into no one's agreeing on anything here in the United States too. I mean, for every person I know that's scared about COVID and wants to follow all the directions coming from the government and what the press is saying, I know the other half is saying this is a big farce and I don't want to do any of the stuff they're asking me to do or whatever that is. When you read a headline here in the United States, typically the headline tends to be really intensely worse than the actual numbers as you get through and digest the article. China is a completely amplified version of that. I mean, if you read the headlines about lockdown, 22 million people populated city outside Beijing, you're like, holy cow, COVID's really starting to take control there again. And then you read the numbers and it's like, what? Like 50? Oh, they had another 22. I mean, it's such a small number. So, I mean, even if you add a zero or another zero to it, it's still a small number. So I don't really know how to process that. And in a way, I'm just trying to there's so much stuff to worry about. And I'm going, you know what? China and the US are not going to get together and work together on COVID. It's just not going to happen. So let's move on. We're both going to deal with it our own way. It's terrible, whatever. We're not in this together. China loves the fact that it's dampening our economy and putting us in this muddled mess. And by the way, I'd argue a lot of the unrest that has been festering for decades actually was inflamed quite drastically by the shutdowns and by people being desperate because they can't put food on the table or pay their rent or all that kind of stuff. So it inflamed an already problematic issue, and China's loving that. So I just don't see what their motivation is to help us whatsoever.
So I think those are all salient points, and I agree. Only pushback I would have is that we talk about feeding the dragon, and part of on our side, we have our own propaganda and stuff that we get to deal with from the media, where we come on the right, left, doesn't matter. Just we have false fake news, to use the term of the day. But when we read the China news, we have to learn to read it from the perspective of we don't want our U.S. policy influenced by what is happening in China. And so when you hear 22 million are shut down over 50, 25, 75 tests, we need to stop and think, A, there's not 50 tests positive. It's probably substantially more. But even if it is one or two zeros, as you say, that's still not a lot in 22 million. But B, how do we think about the fact that shutting down 22 million people in a city over, and start thinking about how we want to respond and how we want our news to cover the story? Because let's talk about Taiwan just for a second. If the worst of the worst were to come with Taiwan, which God forbid we don't want to happen, we're going to get a lot from China about Taiwan. Right. There's going to be a lot of propaganda coming out from their side. And then our side's going to be trying to understand, well, what is our one China policy system? How does that work? How does it play itself out? So there's a sense in which kind of cleansing yourself of thinking through these issues, whether you understand all the nuances of, the COVID vaccine or coronavirus lockdowns in China. There's a sense of just kind of reminding yourself, okay, I have to think about this in terms of how would I want this to play out in America? It is China, so they can do what they want, but are they really giving the real numbers? Do I think these numbers are real? Okay, if this isn't true, then how do I move forward when I read this reporting? And so I think we've kind of boiled it down to China said this is what we respond. And I want to just try to not have the answer, but it's good to remind yourself of what it is you're actually reading and how hard it is to decipher sometimes. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
No, it makes 100% sense. And it's just essentially a more amplified version of what we all need to do when we read news here in the United States of America, depending on what platform it's coming from or who the journalist is or what their political leaning is. You got to think about that when you read the darn article. Like, you're just not getting news, you're getting editorialized news. Right. In China, it's just completely propagandized. And then the way we digest what they're saying there, we need to think about, why are they saying things the way they are? I mean, are they trying to scare everybody to lock themselves into an apartment again so that they don't have to actually forcefully do it? That's probably part of it, and are they actually giving the real numbers to the main part of the populace there? Or are we getting access to maybe stuff that's through VPN sources or whatever it is? Maybe, who knows? It's very hard. And to try to combine the COVID confusion that we all are processing with China, it's almost like taking two hurricanes and combining them together and trying to figure out how to find the eye of the storm. Like, it's just taking two things that are really hard to process and making it almost double as hard. So I don't know. I'm just the COVID thing is just hard to really, put too much of my mental power into. I will say I do have a relatively good piece of news, I think, in regards to our engagement with China moving forward. I've been reading more about Kurt Campbell, who, Trump called the position at the National Security Committee the Asia Czar. I think Biden's renaming it the Indo-Pacific something. But anyway, Kurt Campbell and a colleague of his who hasn't been announced as any part of the National Security Council yet, but he might, is a guy named Eli Ratner. Reading about them actually gives me optimism in regards to how we're engaged China through the first 4 years of Biden's, administration, because it looks like they're relatively hawkish. It looks like they're constructive, but relatively hawkish. In fact, I want to read one quote that I tweeted out earlier from both Eli and Kurt. They said, Washington once again put too much faith in its power to shape China's trajectory. All sides of the policy debate aired. Free traders and financiers who foresaw inevitable and increasing openness in China, integrationists who argued that Beijing's ambitions would be tamed by greater interaction with the international community, and hawks who believed that China's power would be abated by perpetual American primacy. Neither carrots nor sticks have swayed China as predicted. I actually read that and I go, this is interesting. Like, they might take some of the alarms, the fire alarms that Trump pulled and maybe didn't implement very well or follow through on, but they might take them in a constructive sort of way forward with the right kind of momentum and the right kind of engagement to actually properly use leverage from the Western allies and ourselves to actually change some of the dynamics between the U.S. and China. It's optimism, but I am pessimistically optimist.
Well, okay, I will see your good story, and I'll raise you one more. The CCP has not actually said this publicly, but I think it's quite clear that our show single-handedly got the rockets back on TV in China. I don't know if you saw this, Chris. So the rockets back on. We talked about it to happen. I can't think of who else would have been talking about this. So obviously, Feeding the Dragon is responsible for getting the rockets back on TV. So, like, kudos to us, right?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a caveat there, though. Sorry about that. That was Daryl Morey calling me. There's a little bit of a caveat there, right? So the Rockets and the 76ers were completely disappeared in China from any sort of streaming or broadcast. The NBA was streaming on Tencent. The NBA today still is not on CCTV, the broadcast networks. The NBA is only on Tencent streaming, right? So that's a big issue that the NBA is still trying to deal with. The Chinese government did allow the Rockets, now that Daryl Morey is not involved with them, to get onto the streaming platform of Tencent along with the NBA teams other than the Sixers. The Sixers are still not on Tencent or on CCTV, and the rest of the NBA is not on CCTV, but is at least on Tencent. So I guess that's a little progress thanks to Feeding the Dragon podcast.
Thank you for clearing up that we're not back on the main network. Sorry. Yes. In the context of what you just said, yes, the Feeding the Dragon podcast was able to make a little progress. I'm going to send a letter to the CCP and notify them that we will promise that Daryl Morey will get very limited screen time if they put the 76ers on. I think that's a fair deal. Daryl Morey gets limited screen time, which GMs in the NBA usually says a shot of them in the booth. So I think we can work on that. And we've got one thing done. The next step is to get them back on the big screen, the mainstream outlet, so everyone can see them. But I mean, I think we should take the W here. I feel like a W. We should take it. No one else is going to, so we might as well.
Well, I would say one of the W's, in all kidding aside, is that Daryl Morey still stands by what he said. He is still in the NBA, and the NBA is partially back in China to an extent. So it does show that at least he didn't retract what he said to get there, and the NBA didn't completely get rid of him to get back something in China. So I'd like to believe that shows that there is some leverage with that sports team in regards to the Chinese government knowing that there's some importance to having it on in some way. It's still not nearly what it was. And on top of it, the populace in China has been swayed towards the CBA, the Chinese Basketball Association, quite a bit. So the NBA's penetration of that market has diminished as far as consumer excitement around the brand. So it has been a problem, and it's something that the NBA has got to figure out how to get through. But I love the fact that Daryl Morey is still working in the NBA and he hasn't apologized.
Yeah, and with the Olympics coming up again, I would vote to have Daryl Morey, if he wants to be a part of the U.S. Olympic team. I think that would be just kind of one more pushing the envelope forward. And then, of course, we should play China to make sure that all the things are pushed. But there's a sense in which, no, I don't know. I don't know if Daryl wants to do the Olympic team, but that would be a nice touch to the story, is sending Daryl to the Olympics if he wants it, to go and to kind of say, you know what, we're not backing down. If China doesn't want to show the Olympics, that's fine. We're going to throttle their team anyways. And so I think that would be a good way to kind of push it a little bit further with them. To your point, the CBA may be making progress, but that only goes so far. In whatever sports you watch, I love college football, but let's be honest, if the NFL come play college football team, they would just rout them, and you say, okay, I don't want to see more. So the CBA has the advantage now. They don't have the players to take down the NBA, obviously, and so I imagine if they turn it back on to the main channel, plenty of folks will come back to the NBA. I think plenty of folks would, because listen, here in the U.S., we watch players all the time who disagree with us politically. It's a little different in China, I understand, but I think there's probably a big enough appetite to get back to the mainstream. Or once it comes back to the mainstream, rather.
Well, I might add, what's in it for the CCP to want the NBA to get back to what it had? I mean, is that something that plays into something that's good for them and good for their leadership and good for the 1.4 billion people that are just happy enough not to revolt? Or is it better in sort of a way where, we limited the influence that a Western form of sport was having on our people? Let's keep it mitigated. Why bring it back in any sort of significant way? We're seeing that in the Hollywood space. And in fact, on the next episode, I was going to talk about it today, but we're sort of running low on time. But on the next episode, there was a Daily Variety article that I posted about how Hollywood can unite the country. I think that's a pretty tough thing to digest for half of this country right now, but I do have some thoughts on that and how I want to relate it to the way I saw US and China interacting in the making of movies, in the making of content, in the making of stories. There is a really powerful glue there. And I do think if Hollywood can be objective about it and open about it, I think there's an interesting conversation to have where storytelling can unite the country and be a part of that process. But back to Hollywood and China specifically, Hollywood was 80 to 90% of that market, the movies that we released there. In 2019, it dropped down as low as 35%. Last year, it was 16%. Hollywood's going, you know what? Hopefully the Chinese government gets excited and lets us in, lets more movies in, we can get more of a market share back and all that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, why would the CCP want more propaganda from the West made by propaganda companies in the West, which is what movies are, made by movie studios in Hollywood? What's in it for them, right? Like, they've actually, thanks to people like myself and various other cogs in the wheel, we've actually gotten their local film production industry up to speed so that they can cater to their own market better than even Hollywood. So that has satisfied so many different directives of the CCP, including creating middle-class jobs and skilled labor, creating messaging and content in storytelling that's very relevant both to the populace there, but also carries narratives that the Ministry of Propaganda wants. Like, there's so many reasons why it would make no sense for the CCP to allow Hollywood to gain back some market share. None.
Yeah, yes, and I'll close with this. Something that you've said a few times that I've thought about is, for Hollywood or English authors who want to tap into the market, there's a sense in which you said that sometimes the CCP will let a story in that maybe they're hoping that it's viewed in one line of propaganda, but it also could be taken in a different line of propaganda. So you think about Star Wars Episode 4, right? So you have the big evil empire, you got Darth Vader, and you got Luke Skywalker going to blow up the Death Star. Now, I don't know if they can watch that there or not. I'm assuming they can, but that is a very much anti-imperialistic, anti-big government type. You could take that from there. So if Hollywood can develop themes where it's not in your face like this show is, hey, 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 this is what we're saying, but it's kind of nuanced in there and layered in there. Those ideas, they captivate cultures, just like Star Wars has. There's many debates about Star Wars today, and those are the things that Hollywood could probably contribute if they're a little more subtle about it. So I'll let you respond to that. We'll close out.
No, I think that's well said, and I agree with you. And I think there's a lot more I want to tackle in regards to the Hollywood storytelling aspect in between the U.S. and China, and how it can be used to solve problems, how it's also a problem in itself with free speech, censorship issues, all that other kind of stuff. That's definitely 100% in my lane. And I know we've been a little distracted by various other stories, but we're going to hit that in various episodes upcoming. And I think it will be a fun dialogue to have. And hopefully people want to get involved, through tweets and texts and so on and so forth, so we can cover some of that stuff. But in the meantime, I'm off to a sports tournament this weekend, so I'm going to be offline, but I will be reading up on all kinds of great Chinese related stories. Perhaps we maybe do something on Martin Luther King Day on Monday when I get back, or wait until Tuesday. But everybody have a fantastic weekend. Thanks for listening and watching, and spread the word. It seems like we're building a great audience pretty quickly, and we're glad that you're being a part of this.
Yep. Thank you. We will be back next week. The podcast should be on any platform. If it's not, let Chris or myself know. Yesterday, I apologize. I forgot to release it. I downloaded it and just forgot to upload it and release it. So Chris reminded me kindly this morning that I hadn't released it. We try to release these the same day, basically, as we record them, so you can stay up to speed. We'll be back next Monday or Tuesday. In the meantime, the replays are on Periscope, so if you want to watch us, I don't know why you would, but if you want to see these faces, you can, or you can catch it live by going to @Ryan Ray Senior, and we tweet out when they are live, and so you can interact with the show if that's what you want. Chris, be safe in your travels this week, and to the listeners, we will talk to